Oh, hello there. My name is Professor Ludus-Historia, and today we're taking an adventure through the amazingly creative and historical impact of Pokemon. Part 1. Pre-development. Our story begins with Satoshi Tajiri, who was born in 1965 in Mishita, Tokyo. Satoshi spent his early childhood in nature catching bugs. However, with the rapid growth of Tokyo, the places he would go became urbanized. This forced him to search for a new passion, and like most his age, would spend his free time at the arcade, in between his classes. This began Satoshi's passion for gaming. This passion, however, made the last few years of his schooling hard, as he began to do the bare minimum to pass. After graduating, he and his friends, including future Pokemon designer Ken Sugimori, would create the company that would later create Pokemon, Game Freak. However, contrary to what many people may think, the company did not start as a game company. It actually started as a magazine that would publish tips and tricks for games. In fact, it wasn't until Satoshi became dissatisfied with the quality of video games being released did the thought of making a game come to life. A big thing for Game Freak as a whole was the release of the Game Boy, a handheld console by Nintendo in 1989. The console overall was amazing, but for Satoshi, the main attraction was the link cable, which allowed for two consoles to transfer data between them. Satoshi began to think about this in the concept of his childhood and capturing bugs, and how the link cable could be used to transfer quote-unquote live creatures, bringing the first ideas of Pokemon together, and 5 days after the release of the Game Boy, Game Freak officially became a video game company. Game Freak, the now video game company, started with hopes of releasing games that the developers wanted to play. This is actually why the Pokemon games took so long to produce, taking about 6 years of development to fully design and release. During this time, however, the company made several games for other consoles to gain more experience and keep the lights on. The first of these games being released in the same year of its creation, called Mendel Palace on the NES in North America. This gave the company the footing to pitch their passion project to Nintendo in 1990, who at first was hesitant until a major force inside the company backed the idea, who goes by the name of Shigeru Miyamoto, or better known as the creator of Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda. It turns out that Miyamoto was crucial for the development of Pokemon, as at the time Game Freak was experiencing financial difficulties, and without Nintendo's involvement, it was likely that development would fail. However, with Nintendo's support and their team being made up of a passionate people, they began to put their ideas together under what was first titled Capsule Monsters, a name inspired by the show Ultraman that Satoshi grew up with. The name coming from Capsule Kaiju, which were used to capture, kaiju. However, this name ended up causing copyright issues, leading to the project's name being changed to Pocket Monsters, or Pokemon for short. Finally, after all their effort, they could finally begin working on what would become a world sensation, Pokemon. Part 2. Early Development. Satoshi pushed for Pokemon to be an RPG along the lines of the other successful Game Boy game at the time, Final Fantasy Legend. A feature that would come along with this RPG was Charisma, the main way to capture Pokemon initially. However, this was later changed along with a second key stat called Technical Points, which would instead be used for special attacks, with regular moves such as Attack and Defend being the norm instead of the complex set of moves that would make it into the final cut. Now, as stated before, a big thing about this game is the passion behind it. It was the main key to its development, and as such, the designs for the Pokemon were the first things fleshed out, with the world and story coming second. And so it's only fitting to talk about the first few Pokemon designed, that being Lapras, Rhydon, and Clefairy, with Lapras being the main attention of these three as it birthed the philosophy of this world and what features would make it into the final game. Lapras was designed with practicality in mind, as someone who would live and work alongside humans to better their world as a friend, which would inevitably be the course Game Freak takes as they continue development. We can also see this divide when it comes to friends and pets, when they come to the idea of removing buying and selling Pokemon, as it didn't seem the correct thing to do, especially when these creatures were helping the humans of the world. It also makes sense when you take into account that Team Rocket's goal was to make money by exploiting said Pokemon. As stated, the world of Pokemon came second to the Pokemon themselves. As such, the design for the world stays relatively the same throughout the concept art and the final release, with two major differences: the unknown town marked with the letter C, which many have thought could be related to extra content unused in the game's data. But besides this, the only other difference is the route numbers being changed from concept to release. We can also see how the world bent to accommodate Pokemon, such as Lapras being able to transport you around, or how Pokemon can cut down trees, with the world's issues existing to give Pokemon ways to realistically help their human counterparts. Another example of how Pokemon made the world fit them is the Pokemon Centers. Initially designed as hotels that both the trainer and Pokemon could rest at, they eventually became a place where Pokemon could receive the care they need. The concept of Pokemon Centers as a whole explains just how much the world relies on Pokemon as their other half. So much so that their healthcare is just as important as their own, which goes to show how the developers wanted us to feel that the Pokemon were more than just pets. Before we leave the early development portion of this video, I wanted to let you guys in on a not so fun fact that I learned while researching this video. About halfway through development, the main computer that contained all of the data relating to the game crashed, and the data was almost lost. Fortunately, after a lot of research about how the computer worked by Satoshi, they were able to recover the data, and most likely without this intervention or this commitment to recover the data, there just wouldn't be a Pokemon at all. Part 3. Final development. In the final years of development, there were many things added and removed from the game. A major thing added being the nicknaming system. However, its addition would limit the amount of Pokemon on launch to just 30. However, Miyamoto at the nick of time was able to secure more RAM on a better Game Boy cartridge for the project, which allowed the game to hold not just more Pokemon, but also allowing for the nicknaming system to make it to the final release. Without this, the game likely would have never been a smash hit, as the game would have been rendered incredibly small compared to the amount of Pokemon that eventually made it into the game. As the game came closer to launch, the amount of Pokemon was whittled down from over 300 to 30, then to 150 after Miyamoto's intervention, and later to 151 when Mew was discovered. Still, that means over 150 Pokemon never saw the light of day, and we don't really know how many of these designs were used in future games. Now, a big portion of this game's success came down to how well the Game Boy was doing at the time. Unfortunately for Game Freak, the device was on the downtrend in Japan, which made the team begin to shoot for smaller goals, with a full release hoping for around 1 million in sales max. Little did they know how their game would take the world by storm. A reason for this inevitable success was splitting the game into 2 copies, which at first sounds like a way for them to make more money, but the internal reasoning was actually that the 2 versions of the game would allow for more interactions, such as the trading system with the link cable. And if one thing wasn't made clear by the final development of Pokemon, they actually had no limit on their development cycle. In fact, there could be a world where Pokemon was developed for 8 or 10 years, rather than the 6 it did in our timeline. Part 4. Release and outcome. Pokemon Red and Green released on February 27, 1996 in Japan, and during this first day, the team went out to game stores to get an idea of how well the game was doing at the time, because, well, at the time this was the only way. With them reporting that the game was selling well. It wasn't until the deposits from Nintendo and seeing their game in the news that they knew their game was going to be bigger than they could have ever imagined. And even more so after that, the game would spur on an animated series, a card game, and a manga that took everything to the next level, further than anyone ever thought was possible. Even overseas, when the game launched just 2 years later in 1998 as Pokemon Red and Blue, the game caught on because of the initial launch of the animated series before the launch of the games in the region. After a wave of initial pressure felt by the people at Game Freak, well, many things changed, but little actually changed when it came to developing the games. The biggest release, or the biggest impact it actually had, was on the world itself. And Sugimari got to see this firsthand when he took a trip from Paris to London. When walking through a train car, he ran into 2 kids using a link cable to trade across the aisle, which shocked him. At this point, he really understood how far the game's reach had gone. And now onto some final notes. The game's success led to where we are today, with 9 generations of Pokemon, with a 10th on the way. The impact of these games cannot be summed up so easily. These games affected so many people's childhoods, whether it was the card game, the show, or even the countless mainline games or spin-offs. These games, this passion project, that started as one man and his idea of his childhood experiences affected people across the globe. Many people growing up in the 90s all the way until today have some type of experience with Pokemon, and those experiences are what bind this whole idea together. Because without it, the idea of trading, battling, and exploring this world just wouldn't be.